Helo a chroeso i'r gyflwyniad yma ar Rhagolwg Cyllideb Cymru 2022. Welcome to this presentation on the Welsh Budget Outlook 2022. I'm Guto Ifan, a lecturer at the Wales Government Centre and part of the Wales Fiscal Analysis team. I'm also joined by Mae Cian Siôn, and today we'll be talking through some of the findings of our third annual Budget Outlook report. In terms of what I want to cover today, I'm firstly going to look briefly at the UK economic and fiscal outlook before turning my attention to what that means for the Welsh Budget Outlook. I'll then be handing over to Cian, who will be talking about more about our projections of the funding pressures and spending outlook for local governments, before Cian looks at the outlook for households in the non-domestic sector as they deal with record levels of inflation and the cost of living crisis. So firstly, the UK fiscal outlook. It's hard to overstate the change in the economic outlook since we presented the last version of this report. In many ways, the changes of the last year have been a perfect storm in terms of the hit to the economic outlook. The squeeze on real incomes, the rise in interest rates, and a projected fall in house prices all tip the economy into recession. The OBR now forecasts that GDP will fall by 1.4% in 2023. Expectations for unemployment were also revised sharply upwards. Instead of falling next year, unemployment is now expected to rise from 3.6% to 4.9% in 2024. In a Welsh context, that could mean something like 20,000 to 25,000 more people out of work in Wales. GDP is set to return to growth in 2024, but starkly, output recovers its pre-pandemic levels only in the fourth quarter of that year. And as you can see from this chart, we're still well below the levels expected back in March, and especially compared with pre-pandemic forecasts. Turning to the fiscal outlook, this chart shows the forecasted public sector net borrowing and the changes to it into the forecast since March 2022. For underlying forecasts have increased public sector net borrowing upwards by £54 billion a year on average over the forecast period, and 3/4 of that is due to higher debt interest spending, with interest rates now expected to peak at 5% rather than 2% as expected back in March. Also, you've got a weakening economy increasing the welfare spending and reducing government revenues, also impacting on government borrowing later in the forecast period. In terms of fiscal policy changes since March, we've had 4 chancellors, each introducing some elements to fiscal policy, and we've had pretty wild swings in the direction of those fiscal policies. But after all those changes, the main story is one of higher spending on energy and cost of living support this year and next, something in the order of £60 billion additional spending this year and £25 billion next year. In later years, the current Chancellor has penciled in slower growth to spending. So, also announced tax increases, which will more than outweigh the previously announced tax cuts. So you can see there that tax increases and spending cuts reduce borrowing in later years of the forecast. And much of this fiscal tightening comes after the point of the next UK general election. And given the economic outlook that I just outlined, that's probably a sensible decision. The Chancellor was, of course, facing a balancing act between providing economic support to the economy and to incomes, and his stated aim of fiscal consolidation. He perhaps prioritised the former in the immediate term, but that still doesn't avoid a huge drop in incomes and a deep recession. But on the other hand, he only just reaches his fiscal target by a tiny amount by 2027 to get underlying debt falling as a share of GDP. The headroom that he has against those targets are extremely small. So moving on to the Welsh Budget Outlook and what that means for the Welsh Budget. The Welsh Government published its draft budget publishes its draft budget for 2023-24 on the 13th of December. it's updating the indicative spending plans that it originally laid out in December 2021. Three factors affect those spending plans that I want to talk through. First of all, of course, inflation has squeezed the real value of the Welsh budget and those spending plans. Secondly, we've got new devolved tax forecasts and accompanying block grant adjustments, which has some effect on the outlook. And lastly, we've got Autumn Statement 2022 consequentials that were announced last month by the UK government. So first of all, in terms of inflation, if you look back at the original spending plans when they were set back in December and then finalised in March, the spending plans went up to 24-25, and what this chart shows is the average annual real terms change in day-to-day spending over those years. So using the forecast inflation levels that we had at the time when budgets were originally set, that implied a 3.3% average real terms growth over those 3 years, about 2.7% increase for NHS spending, a similar increase in local government funding, and other areas of the budget, around £5 billion, was set to increase quite substantially, influenced by various factors such as replacement EU funding for agriculture becoming part of the budget now, and post-COVID spending on transport. Fast forward to this year, and with the latest forecasts for inflation having increased, that suggests that the real average increase in day-to-day spending over the 3 years of the spending review period has fallen from 3.3% to 2.4%. And that's using the GDP deflator measure of inflation. And while the CPI measure, the Consumer Price Index, garners most attention, real changes in public spending are usually calculated using this GDP deflator. And that's a measure of inflation in the domestic economy. And the increase to that GDP deflator over the next 3 years is less pronounced than is the case for the CPI inflation. The OBR is now forecasting an average of 3.1% per year compared to 2.3% when budgets were originally set. So the GDP deflator is lower in the short term because it's not influenced by higher input prices, which is driving inflation, and in the medium term because of weak demand and slower growth in planned government spending. So by this measure, inflation, as I said, reduces the planned average annual real terms increase in spending to 2.4%. In terms of, it would require an additional £400 million this year, £600 million next year, and £509 million in the last year in 2024-25 to fully restore the original real terms value of the Welsh Government spending plans. However, the GDP deflator is probably not a good measure of the cost pressures facing public services over coming years. One of the main drivers of increased cost pressures would be public sector pay awards. And as I'll discuss later on, pay increases will likely need to be well above the levels expected when budgets were set. And public services are also facing their own significant increases in energy costs. The OBR state that the true impact of inflation on public services will probably lie somewhere between that suggested by the GDP deflator and CPI inflation. So if we take a midpoint between those two measures of inflation, that implies an additional £983 million, so about £1 billion would be required in 24-25 to fully restore the original real terms value of the Welsh Government's day-to-day spending plans. Also influencing the Welsh Government's budget plans will be changes to forecasted devolved tax revenues from the OBR and the projections for the associated block grant adjustments. So there was a small downward revision to income taxes in the latest forecast compared to the forecast produced back in March. There was a large downward revision to forecasted land transaction tax because of the downturn in the housing market expected. But what matters for the Welsh budget is not the overall change in revenues, but the relative change in revenues compared to comparable UK government revenues, because that's what determines the block grant adjustments, the amounts taken away from the block grant to reflect tax devolution. And what this chart shows is the net effect of tax devolution. And that depends, as I said, on the difference between devolved taxes and block grant adjustments. So the overall impact of forecast changes and reconciliations is positive. in 23-24 compared to original spending plans, and a positive again by about £20 million in 24-25. So that's the difference between the dotted black line on the chart there and the solid black line. Driving that positive change despite a worsening of the of devolved revenues compared to the block grant adjustments is reconciliations for income tax forecast errors in 2020-21 and 21-22. So this is a worsening of the outlook for devolved revenues compared to that based on OBR's forecast from March 2022. But the overall net effect of tax devolution is still consistently positive across the spending review period, as you can see from the chart, by an average of around £168 million a year. This net benefit to the Welsh budget is set to grow to £232 million by the end of the forecast period in 27-28 as well. If we consider then the autumn statement, which was published on the 17th of November, the UK government announced, or their headline for the Welsh Government was an additional £1.2 billion of consequential funding. So the UK government announced additional spending on the NHS, social care and schools in England. That was the first top-ups to spending plans since the spending review back in October 2021. They haven't produced or published a full breakdown of the full consequentials for the Welsh Government. This is our attempt at doing so based on the changes to the block grant, estimated changes to the block grant adjustments and reconciliations, and then the information provided in budget documents and policy costing documents by the UK Government. So we think that as a result of additional spending in England, we think the Welsh Government will receive around £378 million next year and £348 million in 24-25. There's also a significant amount of funding that comes from business rates measures in England, so around £266 million next year and £123 million in 24-25. That reduces, those measures reduces revenues from business rates in England, and that means positive consequentials for the Welsh Government. And then it can decide either to replicate or provide similar support through the non-domestic rate system in Wales, or use that funding for public services. The other and residual line that you see there imply a negative consequential, and we think that comes from the removal of the costs associated with the health and social care levy, which has been removed from budgets because that increase in the health and social care levy will not be applied from next year onwards. If we add in all the changes that I mentioned to tax revenues and block grant adjustments and reconciliations, that implies that the Welsh Government does have quite substantial allocations to make at the for next year's spending plans and the year after. In terms of assessing the implications of these changes to the Welsh Government budget, this chart shows the hit to spending plans from higher inflation before and after the autumn statement. So this chart shows the estimated funding that you would require to return day-to-day spending to the real terms value expected when plans were originally set. So this year the hit is about £400 million, next year about £600 million, and then about £500 million in 24-25. If we add in the changes to funding from the autumn statement, that reduces the loss to £220 million in 23-24 and £140 million in 24-25. So we're still below the original plans in real terms, even after the additional funding from the autumn statement. But as I previously mentioned, that's maybe not the best measure of the hit of higher inflation on public services. So if you again take a midpoint between the inflation and suggested by the GDP deflator measure and the CPI measure of inflation, that suggests that the real terms hit is much larger. So even after the changes to forecasted, even after the changes to from the autumn statement last month, the Welsh budget is about £800 million worse off next year compared to where we thought we would be when plans were originally set, and about £600 million in 24-25. If If we turn to the longer term outlook, and while the challenges of the next few years, of this year and the next few years, are frightening, the longer term outlook is not particularly rosy either. So at the autumn statement, the UK government also penciled in slower growth in departmental spending after the current spending review period as part of fiscal consolidation measures. Day-to-day departmental spending is set to increase by an average of 1% per year in real terms after 24-25, after this spending review period, meaning that spending will be about £21.5 billion a year lower by 2027 than what previous plans suggested. So if implemented, that restraint in spending would have big consequences for the Welsh Government funding. And although we don't have a detailed breakdown of UK spending plans and block grant funding after 24-25 yet, we follow the OBR's assumptions to project the Welsh Government funding from 25-26 onwards. And we estimated that over the next 3 years after the spending review period, Welsh Government funding would increase by 1.2% per year in real terms. So if we assume that the Welsh Government pass on consequentials to the NHS from higher spending in England on the NHS, that would imply then that all other areas of the budget would need to be cut by an average of 0.5% per year in real terms over the 3 years after the next spending review period. So with no block grant changes to funding from the autumn statement for this year, the scope appears quite limited to mitigate the real terms hit to the Welsh Government's budget in this year. The Welsh Government's latest plans for 22-23 include about £152 million of unallocated fiscal resource spending, which could be allocated at its second supplementary budget. It also currently plans to draw down £34 million from the Wales Reserve, so that could be increased to £125 million. Beyond that, however, the funding priorities, for example, any funding priorities such as enhanced public sector pay deals, will need to come from reallocating existing spending plans or from late in-year consequentials as a result of the UK government's supplementary estimates. But the outlook for this year looks particularly challenging. For the next 2 years after 22-23, the Welsh Government has some scope to revise its indicative spending plans to adjust to the very different circumstances now facing public services. And to broadly illustrate the options available, we'll be looking at 3 areas of spending, namely the NHS, local government funding through the general support for local government, and then all of the spending. And secondly, we assess how changes to the Welsh rates of income tax might affect the Welsh budget. And then lastly, I'll be looking at public sector pay in the context of the fiscal outlook. So I think that's something that best illustrates the difficult trade-offs facing the Welsh Government and the strains put on devolved budgets over coming years. What this chart shows is the current indicative spending plans that the Welsh Government has for 23-24 and 24-25. So the chart shows the increase on top of this year's allocations next year and in 24-25. So the NHS spending is set to increase by an additional £226 million next year to £9.2 billion, and a further £200 million the year after. Funding for local government is set to increase in real terms slightly over the next few years, increasing by £176 million next year and by a further £128 million on current plans the year after that. Meanwhile, all other areas of spending in the budget, around £5 billion outside of the NHS and local government funding, that increased significantly from last year to this year, but is now set to fall by £16 million next year. And part of the reason for that fall is that 2022-23 plans included significant amount of COVID-19, of cost of living support measures, about £162 million in 22-23, and that's not going to be the case. That's not in current spending plans for 23-24. So what we do here is assume that the Welsh Government essentially follows the spending plans of the UK Government in England and broadly follows the distribution of consequentials that it receives in its allocations and in its revisions to current spending plans. So assuming that the Welsh Government introduced business rates measures or non-domestic rates measures in next year and the year after, and then we make illustrative allocations from passing on consequentials from health spending to the NHS in Wales and from schools and social care spending in England to local government in Wales. So in this scenario, the NHS receives an additional £169 million next year on top of current spending plans. That would mean that it would increase by about 1.1% in real terms next year. If you look across the spending review period from 2021 to 24-25, annual average real terms increases would amount to 2.4% in real terms on average, and that's still below the 2.7% growth planned when budgets were originally set in December 2021. So, and given the increased cost pressures over the last year, that means that the spending will likely fall short of the funding pressures felt by the health service in the aftermath of the pandemic. Meanwhile, local government would be a relative winner from these additional allocations. It would receive an extra £184 million on top of current spending plans next year and £221 million in 24-25. However, as Cian will later outline, there's still significant funding pressures and unfunded pressures, and there'll still be a need for council tax increases on top of these allocations, additional allocations. In terms of all areas, other areas of the spending in the budget, that's still set to fall by around 2.5% in real terms over the next 2 years. There would be some additional funding of approximately £37 million to allocate next year in 23-24. However, if the Welsh Government wanted to fully replicate its cost of living support measures from this year in next year's budget, that would require finding approximately £126 million from other spending areas to fund those measures in 23-24. So in the context of a challenging outlook for public services spending, the Welsh Government could use its income tax powers devolved to it by the Wills Acts 2014 and 2017. So in contrast to the years of austerity budgets at the start of the 2010s, the Welsh Government does now have the power to vary the size of its budget at the margin. For simplicity, we consider a 1p increase across the Welsh rates of income tax for 23-24 and 24-25. So using the latest OBR forecasts and assuming a behavioural impact, we estimate this tax policy would increase revenues by £275 million next year and £288 million in 24-25. And that would represent a 1.4% increase in the Welsh budget in both years. What the chart here shows is the real terms change in Welsh Government day-to-day spending from 2021 to 2024-25. So the dotted red line is the original planned real terms increase using October 2021 inflation forecasts. The solid red line then is what's happened from higher inflation to those current spending plans. And then the purple line is the path of spending implied by our assumptions made after the autumn statement as a result of the funding changes from the autumn statement. So if we add in then the revenues from a 1p increase to the Welsh rates of income tax, that implies that the real terms value of the Welsh budget would be restored to originally planned levels. So the blue line there is above the dotted red line, as you can see, next year and the year after. However, again, as I mentioned, that's using the GDP deflator measure of inflation. So spending would grow by about 2.2% in real terms next year, as opposed to 0.8% under our post-autumn statement assumptions. However, the actual loss from higher inflation is set to be higher than that suggested by the increase in the GDP deflator. So using our alternative measure, again, of a midpoint between the GDP deflator and CPI measures of inflation, day-to-day spending in 24-25 would still be around £340 million lower than originally planned, even after the income tax increase and after the additional funding from the autumn statement. But it does reduce the loss quite significantly. Lastly, I want to analyse the public sector pay bill and the devolved and local government public sector pay bill in the context of the fiscal outlook that I've outlined. And it's something that really illustrates the difficult decisions and trade-offs facing budgets over coming years. In 2020-21, the devolved and local government public sector pay bill in Wales was about £9.1 billion. An impact on public sector pay deals has a big impact on the cost pressures facing public services, but also on the quality of public services delivered by those employees, and of course, on the personal finances of approximately 245,000 employees. As a baseline scenario, we assume that the Welsh Government was budgeting when it set original spending plans for a 2.7% nominal terms increase in public sector pay over 22-23 to 24-25. Under this, that would at the time would have matched CPI inflation or forecast CPI inflation at the time. So we estimate that the total pay bill would have increased by around £460 million in 22-23 on top of 2021-22 figures, and then by £1.4 billion by 24-25. Alternatively, if we assume that public sector pay increases by an average of 5% this year, so that would broadly match the current pay offers for public sector employees, and then the year after it matches, public sector pay deals match average earnings growth of around 3.5%. So if we compare the size of the public sector pay bill, or the estimated size of the public sector pay bill, that increases the total spending on public sector pay by around £288 million. So approximately that's the increase compared to our baseline scenario of what the Welsh Government would have been budgeting for when it set original spending plans. And that's the equivalent to around 7,000 public sector workers. But of course, even though that is an increase in terms of budgeted cost for the Welsh Government and local budgets, that would represent a significant real terms pay cut of 7% over 2 years for public sector employees. And it would mean that pay, again, trails the private sector over those years. In a third scenario, we assume that public sector pay increases or matches CPI inflation of 10.1% this year and about 5.5% next year. And then we compare again the size of the total public sector pay bill compared into the original scenario, and that would increase the public sector pay bill by around £1 billion. That's £1 billion more than what would have originally been budgeted for in 23-24, and that's the equivalent to the cost of employing 24,000 public sector workers in the devolved and local government sectors. So the large and unforeseen increase in inflation does mean that public sector pay will have to increase by more than what was planned when budgets were originally set. However, in the context of the budget outlook described, it appears likely that public sector pay will again fall in real terms. The Welsh Government therefore faces a series of very tricky decisions, balancing the additional costs of higher pay rises for public sector employers against the risks of large real terms pay cuts. For example, a further rise in recruitment and retention issues, the threat of industrial action, and a general deterioration in the quality of public services delivered. And of course, those decisions are made increasingly difficult or more difficult in the context of a decade of pay stagnation relative to inflation and private sector pay. Of course, it makes it incredibly difficult during the time of increased inflation that we're currently seeing. So in the absence of further additional funding from the UK government, or significant increases in devolved income tax rates, funding for higher public sector pay deals will need to be found either from non-pay budgets or from reduced public sector employment. I will now hand over to Cian, who will look at our funding and spending projections for local government services and then the outlook for households and the non-domestic sector. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch, Guto. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about the outlook for local authorities in Wales. What do the UK and Welsh Government spending plans mean for councils' ability to meet their cost pressures over the coming years? On the screen, you can see the size of the local government settlement adjusted for inflation going all the way back to 1999. We saw rapid growth in the size of local authority budgets during that first decade of devolution. That was, of course, then followed by a decade of austerity that was only briefly interrupted by the pandemic. The Welsh Government did announce a large 9.4% increase to the revenue settlement in 2022-23. In fact, in cash terms, and at the time the budget was set in real terms as well, this was the largest single year increase to the settlement in the history of devolution, if you put those COVID years to one side. But even back then, the spending increases that had been penciled in for next year, 2023-24, and 2024-25, were relatively small by comparison. And these cash increases, of course, now have been eroded further by higher than expected inflation. You can see how that line on the chart sort of goes to nearly horizontal in those final 2 years. Our latest assessment is that after you adjust for inflation, the core settlement will only grow by 0.3% next year, which is, to all extents and purposes, a cash flat settlement, and 1.1% in the year after. By 2024-25, the value of Welsh Government funding to local authorities is still expected to be 6.6% below its 2010 high and more than 11% lower on a per capita basis. So the plans laid out by the Welsh Government last year implied that there would be £175 million added to the settlement in 2023-24. But there was some good news last month. The Chancellor did announce additional funding for schools and social care in England, which triggered consequentials for Wales. As always, the Welsh Government has discretion over how it allocates this additional funding. But if these consequentials are rolled into the local government settlement, that could more than double the projected increase in funding next year. In fact, if you look at the chart on the screen, by 2024-25, we estimate that the settlement would be around £220 million more generous than what had been implied by the plans set out last year, and this is in cash terms. And for the rest of the analysis today, we do assume that these school, social care and a proportional share of negative consequentials announced last month, that these are all passed on to Welsh local authorities in full over the next 2 years. It's worth saying, I think, that in England, councils are also set to benefit from the decision that was made there to relax the referendum requirements for council tax increases. So they will now be able to propose increases of up to 5% a year without triggering a referendum. Now, of course, we haven't had a formal cap or a referendum requirement here in Wales, but council tax increases of 4 or 5% were already the norm here, at least pre-pandemic. So that's the funding outlook. We've also updated our projection of local authority spending pressures over the next 5 years. There is a lot of detail in the report on this and the accompanying annex as well, if you really want to get into the weeds about the assumptions and the methods we use. So I'm going to keep things relatively brief here. But the headline figure from our central projection is that between 2021-22 and 2020-24-25, that spending will need to grow by an average of 4.2% a year to meet pressures by the end of the spending review period. And as you might expect, because of the profile of inflation, you would need larger increases than that this year and next year. We then expect more modest increases will be required in those final 3 years of the forecast, as both inflationary pressures as well as earnings growth are expected to eventually subside. If we take those revenue projections, subtract the amount required to meet spending pressures, we can derive the implied funding gap. So this is the shortfall in funding, or the projected shortfall in funding required to meet council's cost and demand pressures. As you can see from the leftmost chart, we project that with annual council tax increases of 2% over the next 2 years, local authorities will be around £350 million short of the funding required to meet pressures in 2024-25. And this is assuming that additional consequentials are made available to them over the next 2 years. That gap does close slightly if you assume larger council tax increases of 4 or 6% a year. Now, we debated whether or not to include the forecasts for 2025 onwards on these charts, because on current UK plans, departmental UK government spending is set to grow by only 1% a year in real terms after 2025. And as Guto explained, if we assume that health spending grows slightly more quickly than that, and that the Welsh Government passes on these health consequentials to the NHS, then the amount of additional funding available for everything else is actually very, very small. In this scenario, the local government settlement would grow by just 0.7% a year between 2025-26 and 27-28. That's equivalent to an annual reduction of 0.5% in real terms. And these lean spending plans would launch council finances onto an unsustainable trajectory. If you assume council tax increases of 2% a year over the next 5 years, that funding gap could grow to £660 million by 2027-28. If you assume higher costs, that could grow to nearly £1 billion. You would need council tax increases of 6% just to stabilise the fiscal position by the end of the forecast period. And then, even then, you would still need to find £250 million worth of cuts. Now, I should stress that there are good reasons for thinking that the real cuts penciled in for the final 3 years of the forecast will not be realised, not least because a general election is due to be held before the end of 2024. But also recent history tells us that most governments do end up topping up their spending plans during the spending review period. Jeremy Hunt, last month, he emphasised the need for the government to restore its credibility after the fallout from the mini-budget. And, in some respects, there was an attempt to do that. He did adopt more stringent fiscal targets. But at the same time, I think it's difficult to look at the plans for UK spending post-election and conclude anything but, these are neither credible or deliverable. And so you can decide for yourselves whether or not to take the projections for the final years of the forecast at face value or not. Now, I should also stress that in practice, any discussion of council funding gaps is purely theoretical because local authorities are legally obligated to set balanced budgets. Any funding shortfall that does exist, that would either need to be met from reserves, which can only be spent once, or by cutting back on service provision, or through larger council tax increases, probably a combination of all three of those things. All of this suggests that a return to an era of spending cuts and above inflation council tax increases may well be on the cards. This year, council tax grew by only 2% on average across Wales, but given the tough fiscal outlook and also, I think, the political cover provided by the decision to effectively greenlight council tax increases of 5% in England, I think we can expect much larger increases next year, which is of course problematic given the already bleak outlook for household finances, and in our view it only strengthens the case for reforming council tax, which is regressive with respect to property value and incomes as well. Now, for the final section of today's presentation, I'm going to turn to look at the outlook for households, businesses, as well as the rest of the non-domestic sector. Starting with the non-domestic sector, over the past 3 years, quite large amounts of support has been delivered through the NDR system. During the pandemic, a combination of grant payments and reliefs were used. This year, retail, leisure and hospitality premises have been eligible for a 50% relief on their rates. And for the past 2 years as well, the multiplier, which is the mechanism used to increase tax bills year on year, that's been frozen. Normally it's uprated in line with CPI inflation each year. Now, all of this means, as it stands, most businesses in the retail, leisure and hospitality sectors face what you might call a double whammy in April next year, because you've got the last of the COVID reliefs expiring, and the multiplier, and by extension tax bills, are also set to rise by 10.1%. Just to illustrate what that looks like, I mean, a typical restaurant in Wales faces 120% increase in their NDR bill overnight. You know, if we take the average rateable value for a Welsh restaurant, that's equivalent to an increase of more than £8,000 a year, just as the UK government's energy bill relief scheme expires. So you're probably aware that the price guarantee for households, the cap on energy bills, that's been extended until April 2024, but the equivalent cap that was put in place for businesses and the non-domestic sector this winter, that is still set to expire in April next year. And so I think there will be calls for the Welsh Government to deliver additional support through the NDR system next year. The good news is there were additional consequentials announced last month as a result of business rates decisions in England. The UK government decided to freeze bills for another year, which permanently boosts the Welsh budget by roughly £90 million each year. They also announced that the retail, leisure and hospitality sectors will benefit from a 75% discount on their bills next year, and that provides a one-off boost to the Welsh budget of around £115 million. Now, given that this is a one-off boost, so it doesn't roll into the baseline in following years, as most consequentials do, I think it's likely that this will be used to fund some sort of time-limited support package for households or businesses in Wales. There were, if you look at the bars in blue there as well, there were some smaller consequentials from a few other time-limited reliefs that were announced in England. But even if we think the Welsh Government ought to deliver more support to the non-domestic sector, I think there are still important questions that we need to ask about who to target. I mean, perhaps you think we should be targeting non-domestic users that have high energy needs, or maybe users that have high energy needs relative to their turnover, in which case you would probably target restaurants, hotels, maybe even the manufacturing industry with additional supports. But if we think we ought to be discouraging inefficient use of energy, we might want to preserve that incentive for businesses to cut down on energy consumption and target that support to sectors where maybe it wouldn't be as desirable to use what economists might call price signalling to depress output. So presumably, I mean, we wouldn't want hospitals to limit the number of operations they perform, or schools to limit their opening hours to cut back on energy costs, in which case maybe the public sector should be supported. Or maybe we think we should be targeting most of our support to actors that have limited ability to pass on these higher costs to the end user. So, whereas businesses can always increase prices to cover higher costs, many charities, for instance, are operating with relatively fixed income streams, and so they might have no option but to absorb higher costs. And by the way, I'm not claiming that this is an exhaustive list of rationale or principles, but I do think it's interesting that the UK government decided to single out the retail, leisure and hospitality sectors for support. That continues the arrangement that we saw during the pandemic. But whereas at that time it was clear, I think, that these were the sectors that were being hit hardest by lockdown restrictions, reduced consumer footfall and all that went with that, it might be less obvious today that this is where we should be targeting most of our supports. Then once you've decided who to support, there's then the separate question of, well, how do you deliver this support? You might think that NDR reliefs or freezing the multiplier are the obvious answers, but I don't think it's that straightforward, because as it stands, 77% of premises have a rateable value of less than £12,000 in Wales, but together they account for less than 5% of the total tax take. And then on the other hand, you've got premises with a rateable value of more than £100,000. These make up less than 3% of the property stock, but contribute nearly 60% of all liabilities. And if you were to introduce sort of a blanket relief, so to speak, you would see the vast bulk of the benefits go to a small number of very large premises, which will often be owned by multinational companies. Now, there are ways around that. You could impose an upper cap on the amount of support received, or exempt businesses over a certain rateable value from receiving that support. But ideally, I think you would also supplement reliefs with additional grant payments for smaller businesses and charities, many of whom are already paying nothing or very little through the NDR system and would therefore benefit comparatively little from tax reliefs alone. Turning to look at households, there's a lot going on this chart, but essentially it shows the value of cost of living support measures announced before the summer. So each bar represents an income decile. So the leftmost bar shows the value of support for the poorest decile of Welsh households. Then the bar on the right, the bar on the very right, shows the value of support for the most affluent households. And if we take those measures together, the energy bills rebate that was announced in Feb, the council tax rebate, the tax changes announced at the spring statement, as well as the various targeted payments that were announced in May this year, the overall support package has actually been fairly evenly distributed across the income distribution this year. So we estimate that the average Welsh household benefited to the tune of £1,300 from these measures. Then you've got the energy price guarantee, of course, one of the few remaining legacies of Liz Truss's premiership. That might save the typical household a further £800 this winter, which would bring the total value of support this year to more than £2,000. And for the most part, we do think that government support measures will offset the increased costs, the increased energy costs, I should say, faced by households in 2022-23. Now, there are caveats to that statement. It might not apply to households with higher than typical energy consumption because of the way the cap operates. Households that are not on the mains gas grid will have received less support overall. And of course, it doesn't offset the price rises for other goods and services that we've seen, including food items. So what about next year? Well, I think there was a shift in UK government policy at last month's autumn statement. They opted not to renew the universal support measures. They made the energy price guarantee less generous, whilst at the same time they sort of doubled down on the use of targeted payments to vulnerable households. So these included a £900 payment for low-income households, £300 for pensioners and £150 to individuals that are eligible for certain disability benefits. And I do think this shift in approach is welcome, given the evidence showing how households can experience the same inflation rate very differently. So, rising food prices are now a key driver of inflation, and we know that this has a disproportionate impact on the poorest households. It does mean that the effects of next year's payments are progressive across the income distribution, boosting the disposable income of the poorest decile of households in Wales by 10%. And that's on top of the 10.1% increase that is planned for most benefits, including the state pension from April. However, because these payments are not going to be accompanied by the various rebates next year, and because the typical price cap is now going to be increasing from £2,500 to £3,000 from April, most households, including poorer households, will still receive less support next year than they did this year. So a household eligible for next year's means tested £900 payment will still be paying more than twice as much on energy as they did 3 years ago. A household which isn't eligible for any of these new targeted payments will probably be paying around 3 times as much. If we zoom out and look at the longer term trends in incomes, unfortunately the picture is even more bleak. So this chart shows the longer term trend in real disposable income levels. So that's income after adjusting for taxes and benefits. You can see up until the financial crisis, incomes in Wales had been growing at a pretty steady pace. That's suddenly changed after 2008, and since then income levels have flatlined. And what's worse is the OBR's assessment, its most recent assessment, is that this trend will continue over the next 5 years. So using those projections, by 2027, real disposable incomes in Wales are now expected to be over £10,000 lower than had the pre-financial crisis trend been sustained. And we're hoping to publish new analysis in the new year, which suggests that we are international outliers in that regard as well. So even once the worst impacts of the cost of living crisis are behind us, I think we do need to seriously reflect on the future trajectory of UK economic and fiscal policy, with the aim of trying to halt this relative decline that we've seen in incomes and living standards. So some food for thought there to end the presentation. Don't forget, there is plenty more analysis, charts and maps available in our full Welsh Budget Outlook report. You can download the PDF from the Wales Government Centre website. Just go to Publications, then click on Finance. Or alternatively, you can use the shortened URL, which is on the screen now, or you can just click on the link in the description. So diolch yn fawr am wylio, a gobeithio y gwelwn i chi mewn digwyddiad dadansoddi Cyllideb Cymru unwaith eto yn fuan. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you at another Wales Fiscal Analysis event very soon.